the great scholar kings of Europe: Roger of Sicily, Frederick II of Sicily, who's the grandson of Roger, and then a person named Alfonso the Wise. We'll see him in books showing up as Alfonso X, and because of course you have all these Rogers and Fredericks and Alfonsos in line here. But I'll go through these people because they're really very, very important in terms of scholar kings. Roger of Sicily, 12th century, and I should show you the, okay. In the 12th century, he brought in a scholar by the name of Al-Idrisi, and he said to Al-Idrisi, I want you to gather together scholars, and we're going to create something called the Academy of Geography. And I want you to get rid of the myths and figure out what is myth and what's reality, and I want you to make a map, as close as you can, a map of what we know about the world today. So Al-Idrisi sent out people to interview people and find out, where's this mountain, what's this mountain called, how long is that river, have you ever been here, is there a desert down there, what's over here? And so ironically, one of the things that they did was they went out and they interviewed tax collectors, because these were the people who knew the geography. So they just said, because these are the people who are going out and collecting, and so they interview these people. And he made one of the most accurate maps of the world at that time in the 12th century. One of the things that, here's a paper, what he did is he made something called a planisphere, which is a 300-pound silver circular disc with the map of the world etched into it. And that no longer exists. But he also did, he ended up doing paper ones as well. And one of the things that is interesting is that he actually had the map upside down according to the way we look at the world today. But I flipped it over just because it was confusing, because people looked at it and said, I don't get it. But here's the Saudi Peninsula right here. And this would be Europe up here, and here's the Mediterranean. Here's Africa over here. So it's really, and here's your water. He understood there's water all around the world, which people didn't understand at that time. These are mountain chains that are going all the way to China. He's got the Tian Shan Mountains coming up over to China here. So it was pretty advanced for that time, really was. But Roger of Sicily, this one over here, who brought Al-Idrisi into the academy, he also studied Arabic, and he had a lot of Arab influence in his palace and in his court. And he pretty much ended up bringing some real hatred towards himself amongst the other Christian rulers, because they resented the fact that there were so many Muslims and so many Jews in his court. And they thought he should just have Christian scholars, and he shouldn't have Muslims, and he shouldn't have Jews. And one of the things that they started calling him finally, because his coronation robe had all sorts of Arabic writing on it, and that's actually in a museum. It's not Cleveland, but that coronation robe still exists. And it's all written in Arabic. And people started calling him the baptized Sultan of Sicily. But again, he had that planisphere created by Al-Idrisi. Another thing Al-Idrisi made two things. He made the planisphere out of silver, 300 pounds, and he made a book called the Book of Roger, all geography. And one of the things, the Book of Roger. And one of the things that happened, though, was when Roger died, Sicilian barons came in. They got a hold of that planisphere made of silver, and they melted it down and used it for cannonballs. So that's why it's gone. So all we have at this point is this map to kind of indicate what had been on that planisphere. And then the Book of Roger was written in Latin, and the Sicilian barons burned it. And so they, what happened though was Al-Idrisi had the original Arabic that he had written, and he literally, as they were attacking, literally escaped on a donkey, with himself on one donkey, and his manuscripts on another, and went to Morocco. So that's how we know what was in the Book of Roger, is that the Arabic, original Arabic, continued and did not get burned. The other person I wanted to look at was Frederick II, King of Sicily, who's right here. This is the grandson, as I said, of Roger, and he kind of continued his grandfather's traditions of studying Arabic, of studying Arabic scholarship, and having Arab scholars at his court. Obviously, he also had Christian scholars as well, and one of them who ends up becoming kind of important is this guy right here, who is in Frederick's court, and his name is Count Landolt of Aquino. he has a son who becomes a very famous Christian Catholic scholar, St. Thomas Aquinas. That's the father of St. Thomas Aquinas. So St. Thomas Aquinas, as a child, is running around this court that's loaded with Arab scholars. And so he's getting a kind of an interesting combination of Arabic and Christian and Jewish scholarship as well. Going back to the development of universities, this man over here, the King of Sicily, Frederick II, ended up developing the University of Naples, and it had the first department of Oriental Studies in it, and it also had a department of Arabic language. And St. Thomas Aquinas ended up studying at the university that this man created. St. Thomas Aquinas, I'll talk about a little bit because he's really important in terms of the links between Islamic scholarship and European scholarship. He was born in 1225, died in 1274, and he's one of the most important theological scholars of Europe. He wrote a book. He's Catholic. Of course, Europe's Catholic at this time. Called Summa Theologica. And if you look at it, it's the summary of our theology, right? I mean, that's it. It's pretty obvious what that is. Summa Theologica. I had mentioned that the Catholics, the early Christians, the Catholics are trying to decide who are we, what do we believe, what's the nature of Christ, that one in particular. And is Mary the mother of God, is she Theotokos, or is she the mother of Christ, is she Theochristos? And people literally killed each other during the debates on this, because they would say, you're destroying Catholicism, you're destroying Christianity, and they literally killed each other over this debate. So he finally just said, okay, stop it. I'm going to sit down, and I'm going to write the summary of Catholic theology. And he pretty much set the foundation of what is practiced today in Catholicism. It goes back to St. Thomas Aquinas. So you see, for instance, so many schools called Aquinas, private Catholic schools called the School of Aquinas or whatever, Boys' School of Aquinas, Girls' School of Aquinas. It's because he was really the person that kind of said, stop it. Here's where we're at. Here's what we believe. So I wanted to mention him because he's going to come back later on when we're looking at somebody named Ibn Rushd, because Ibn Rushd ends up having a very, very strong influence on the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas. Okay, Alfonso the Wise, who's also Alfonso the X. He'll also show up in your books as Alfonso il Sabio, which is just Latin for Alfonso the Wise. But he is showing up in our books now. And he is a 13th century ruler of Spain, and he's descended from Alfonso VI. And I had talked about the falling of Toledo to the Spaniards, that the Christians started the Reconquista, the reconquering of Islamic Spain, and it began in 1085 with the conquering of Toledo. And it was this Alfonso VI who ended up doing this, taking Toledo, and he gave himself the name, a brand new title called Emperor of the Two Faiths. So there was actually a Christian Spanish king who had himself not quite crowned, but he gave himself the title of Emperor of Islam. So because he was studying Islam, he was studying Arabic, he was studying these books. So he's one of the people who took the city of Toledo and said, whoa, look what we've got here. Look at this library, look at these books, look at this knowledge. So he started studying it and declared himself Emperor of Islam. So Alfonso X is his descendant, of course. And one of the things that Alfonso X did, he's 13th century descendant of Alfonso VI, is he ends up making something called the Alphonsine star charts, and names them after himself, of course. He's king. And what he did is he took sort of like the summary of all the knowledge that had been gathered and turned it into a Latin book and made star charts so that people could go outside literally with his chart and say, there's Betelgeuse, the shoulder of Orion over there. There's this, there's that, there's the Milky Way. And so he became very much the person who set the foundations for astronomy in Europe by gathering together this stuff and bringing it up. So he's a very important guy. He also started a university, University of Seville. So you notice the link here. This stuff is kicking off the whole university system within Europe. Okay, I'm going to move on to the church. I'm Gerberto Orlac. ends up becoming Pope. And he's Pope Sylvester II. So you'll see him in books both ways. Then we're going to look at Peter the Venerable and Robert of Ketton, all of them very important. These two are linked up together in an important way. So let's look at Pope Sylvester II. He was caught using an astrolabe. And an astrolabe is something that was invented by the Arabs, and it was very, very important because what you can do with an astrolabe is figure out where you are on the planet. So think about it. If you're on a ship and you're on the west coast of Africa and somebody says, we're going to look for countries to the west, and you're going to be looking at that coast and it's going to be going farther and farther away, and you're going to be getting more and more nervous. And one of the things that early explorers did was they sort of hugged the coastline. So they'd sort of make this little bouncy thing down. The Portuguese, for instance, would go down the west coast of Africa and make little tiny trips, stop. And then they found out about the astrolabe. And there were different instruments that the Arabs had come up with that could tell you where you are on the earth. And it was obvious that they had figured it out that it was round. People were still saying a ship goes off and sinks. Some people still believed that. But the whole idea of the round earth was starting to be pretty much accepted. But this Pope ended up being caught using an astrolabe, and it was actually so unusual that he was accused of being a magician and an alchemist because they weren't familiar with numbers, with the Arabic numerals, and they still saw that as magic, and they saw the astrolabe as magic, and they did not like this. And one of the things that Europe had to kind of deal with was the embarrassment of having a Pope who's being accused of being an alchemist and a magician, and what do you do when it's the Pope? With these accusations, but he was very polite and died, and so he died quickly, so they didn't have to worry about it too much. But he really kind of set Europe into a big flurry of what do you do when the Pope's being accused of magic. Peter the Venerable and the scholar monks of Cluny. There was a monastic group, scholar monks in Cluny, and Peter the Venerable was one of the people who started that group. And one of the things that you'll find in books that isn't quite right is often Peter the Venerable is presented as this man who devoted his life to being a bridge between Islam and Christianity. And he was in some ways, but not in a really good way, in the sense that he's credited with paying Robert of Ketton to translate the Quran into Latin. And he's credited Peter the Venerable with doing something that was considered very unusual at that time. He's credited with saying, let's go to the source. If you're going to study Islam, go to the Quran. And if you're going to study Islam, go to the Hadith. Don't go to people who are the so-called experts on Islam. Go to the source. But the reason he was doing this was actually to refute Islam, not to support it. And so one of the things he did is he hired Robert of Ketton to translate the Quran, and he did, and he gave it the title, I love this, the first Latin translation of the Quran, straight from Arabic to Latin, by Robert of Ketton, 12th century, was called Muhammad the Pseudo-Prophet. So that kind of gives you an idea of what they were up to in terms of translating this stuff. And this book was used basically to trash Islam, but he had the closest translation that had ever been made, because people just were kind of making up stuff, and he had a pretty close one. That ended up becoming the standard translation of the Quran in Latin for Europeans until, of course, the 16th century, when people started sort of writing things and looking at things differently and saying, maybe the book's not really called Muhammad the Pseudo-Prophet, then maybe the word Quran's kind of important to these people, and maybe we should actually call it the Quran. Peter the Venerable is actually famous for writing two very important manuscripts. One of them is called the Treatise Against the Jews, and the other one's called the Treatise Against the Saracens, which is what they called the Muslims. But he did feel, one of the things that's interesting about Peter the Venerable, and Khalid Blankenship will be talking about this, is the links between Christianity and Judaism and Islam. And one of the things that Peter the Venerable did say is that Muslims are a heresy within Christianity, but they can be brought back into the fold of Christianity because they have given Mary and Jesus a very critical role in their faith. They're very central to the faith of Islam. So he did say, what we need to do is bring these people back into the fold of Christianity. Peter the Venerable is also the person who wrote against the violence of the Crusades. Instead, the Crusades should not be geared at killing the Muslims. It should be geared at bringing them back into Islam, or back into Christianity, and converting them. It's like, don't kill them, convert them. One of the things that I did find, that he had written to St. Bernard, who's the guy who kicked off the Crusades, and he wrote and said that he's following a tradition of passing over no heresy in silence, because as I said, he sees Islam as a heresy within the Christian faith. And then he goes on to say that he is showing through his writings and through his arguments that Islam is detestable and damnable. So, as I said, a lot of times books kind of present him as, the sort of Smurfy guy who's this bridge between Islam and Christianity, and he's really kind of going against it. But as I said, he should be credited with going to the sources. That was kind of, at that time, kind of an unusual idea. Okay, I'm almost at the end here. Michael Scott and the transmission of Ibn Rushd's commentary to Europe. I wanted to talk about that. There's a scholar from Scotland, there's a shocker, named Michael the Scot, and he ends up being a librarian at the court of Frederick II of Sicily. Frederick II was a guy in the big robes, and I had Count Lundak of Aquinas there. And he ends up getting a hold of a book by a man named Ibn Rushd. And Ibn Rushd is showing up in our books as Averroes, same guy. So if you see him in your textbook, Averroes, it's Ibn Rushd. I think that's how it's spelled. Did I spell that right? That's a Latinized version of his name. But one of the things that Ibn Rushd did is he wrote commentaries on Aristotle. And so one of the things that happened was that his commentaries were translated by Michael Scott, who was working for Frederick II. Michael Scott took these things up into Europe, these books up into Europe, and it caused an absolute revolution in terms of philosophy in Europe. Because one of the things that his writings did, Aristotle had tried to prove the existence of God in a scientific manner. And so did St. Thomas of Aquinas. He was just ripe for that and really wanted to kind of fuse together and say you can have science and you can have religion and they're not clashing, they can still be together. And you're seeing this sort of stepping towards humanism at this point. You're in the medieval era, you're heading towards the Renaissance era. And Michael Scott is translating these books by Ibn Rushd, and these are becoming very popular with St. Thomas Aquinas. And Ibn Rushd and St. Thomas Aquinas are both writing and saying there's not a clash. You can study disease, and you're not going against God by doing this. And it's important to point this out to your students, where somebody might die from the plague, and people will say, well, you died from the plague because you're a sinner. That's why you got the plague, and that's why you're dying. And don't try to fight it because this is God's will. And somebody else can say you're dying from the plague because you picked up a germ and there's a stuff called miasma or bad air, and there's something with the air and there's something traveling through the air that gave you the plague, and we can treat you with lemon and vinegar and draining those pustules. We can treat you. And so this person might say, you know what, you're going against the will of God by doing that. And so there's writings showing up now saying you're not, that you can still be a person of faith and still work with science within the scientific community. So one of the things that happens right on this painting, this is Raphael's School of Athens, thanks. School of Athens, and here's Ibn Rushd right here. So he actually shows up in the painting. So you've got, again, the clash too between Plato and Aristotle, mysticism and sort of rationalism. And one of the things that Ibn Rushd does is he ends up sort of kicking off this rationalism, really making it popular, and Aristotle's writings popular in Europe, and especially at the University of Paris, which is where St. Thomas Aquinas is teaching at that point of his life. He's in his 40s and he's teaching at the University of Paris. So as St. Thomas, remember I told you St. Thomas of Aquinas is writing the Summa Theologica. He's saying, here's what we think, here's our religion, here's Catholicism, here's our faith, here's where we're at. So stop the fighting, here's where we're at. He ends up quoting Ibn Rushd 200 times during his writing. So what you end up with is a Muslim scholar from Spain having a very, very strong influence on Catholic theology at the University of Paris. And one of the things that happened with his book was it actually became banned by the church. And of course, what's going to happen, you've got a bunch of college students at the University of Paris reading this book, and it's banned by the church. So what do you think happened? more of them read it. It became really popular. It was like, thank you very much. So then more people read it. And so they actually strengthened the punishment for being caught reading it. And then finally, that was 1215 where they had to strengthen the law. And then by 1256, it actually became required reading at the University of Paris. So things kind of flipped. And did sort of a 180. So they said, okay, this guy actually has some good points. He's sort of bringing us the same, sort of connecting us to Aristotle and the teachings of the Greeks and rationalism and linking science and rationalism and religion together. And it's okay, because he was seen very much as a threat.